I'm Tony Ruiz, contributing editor at Gold Derby, here with Ron Nyswaner, the creator and executive producer and writer of Fellow Travelers. And Ron, we were just talking beforehand that my first exposure to this material was actually the operatic version that was adapted for the stage. When did you first become aware of the book?
I read it 12 years ago and immediately wanted to make a television series out of it. Steve Golan at Anonymous Content, Steve is no longer with us, optioned the book for me. And then, I got distracted by having to make a living. And I went and I worked on a couple of television shows you may have heard of, Ray Donovan and Homeland for a few years. And then somewhere my interest was rekindled about, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And luckily the book, the opera had been made, which I haven't seen. And but the book was available for option. I was very pleased.
And so, what was it about the book initially that made you think this would be a great television series?
Hawk and Tim. Hawkins Fuller, first of all, which is the best name for a character that I can ever imagine. Hawkins Z. Fuller. Genius on Mr. Mallon's part. And then and Tim, that relationship, that push and pull of a relationship where people aren't giving or getting as much as they feel that they need to give or get, but then they try and then they fail. And it was a very sexy relationship, and I love the power in it. And sometimes, Tim had a little power over Hawk because Hawk did feel for him. But Hawk was so protective of his feelings that it made him, he tried to hide those feelings. And that is what interests me about characters, that when they try to hide themselves and they don't know themselves as well as they might think that they do. I'm much more interested in that kind of character than than a victim, for example.
And so in adapting this, I always love the concept of taking, as an English teacher, I love the concept of taking novel source material and how it's adapted. How did you go about, creating kind of like the structure? How closely did you adhere to the book? Where did you expand?
Well, I expanded a great deal. I love the essence of the book. I love Hawk and Tim. But the demands of a television series are very different from the demands of a novel. Mr. Mallon, can be in people's heads, and he's mostly in Tim's head in the book, and that's a different experience. The book doesn't go beyond 1957. So, we created the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And I also brought in the AIDS crisis, which is such a formative event in my life that I just thought that the parallel of the government's persecution of homosexuals in the 50s with the government's indifference to the deaths of homosexuals from AIDS in the 80s, that was a great bookend for a show. And I just saw that somehow Hawk and Tim would somehow meet in the 80s. Tim would have AIDS. And then we started to fill in everything in between. Also, created, and a lot of history was sort of added in some ways. So Senator Smith is not a character in the book. He is based on Senator Lester Hunt. Lucy is not a character in the book. I think she's seen across a room once or something, but that marriage is not really present in the book. So all those things offer dramatic opportunities for writers to write, for actors to act. And so we started building from, but always going back to the essence of Mr. Mallon's creation of that relationship between Hawk and Tim.
And so therefore, with those two characters at the center, the casting really has to be perfect. And I think it's inarguable at this case that the casting is not perfect. It is. And so how early in the process were Matt Bomer and Jonathan Bailey considered for these parts?
Well, Matt was the third person involved. So when I came back to the book, and I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, I went to my friend and colleague Robbie Rogers, the great producer. He suggested Matt. I thought, well, that's genius. And then we met with Matt on a Zoom call, and Matt came on as an EP before there was anything else, before there were scripts, even before there was a pitch, because Matt participated in the pitches. So Matt was there all along, and there's just that, the perfection of Matt playing Hawkins Fuller is it couldn't be better. It seemed inevitable. And then, with Johnny, we had a green light by that point. So Johnny came in around the time that we knew we were going to actually make the show, and he was first choice. But we are very concerned about Bridgerton, which was shooting in London at the same time we'd be shooting in Toronto, and the idea of your, co-star shuffling back between London and Toronto on a very ambitious, expensive, complicated show that goes through 4 different decades was really, really scary to all of us. And at some point, we just said, well, we have to take the leap because he is so perfect for Tim. So so we took the leap, and it all worked out. There were some struggles along the way, especially for poor Johnny, who got off of, and then he started doing, toward the end of the shoot, he got involved in Wicked. So he's doing Bridgerton, Wicked, and our show. And but he showed up, and he was Tim, no matter what he had been maybe a few hours earlier.
Yeah, one of the things that people have told me is, just the logistical thing of this, because you're not shooting chronologically, you're shooting across these 4 decades, and sometimes you're shooting, back and forth between these decades. Just logistically, what did that look like just from a showrunner's perspective?
Exhausting. Like really, like hospital level exhaustion. But I got through it. There was one day, I think, where we shot in all 4 decades. And that was because there were some days where we had tandem crews. I mean, we had 2 different crews shooting different things at the same time. I remember being shuffled back and forth between sets. But that really, my job was very, very clear, is that because I've been with this material for so long, throughout the creation of it, that I was there to be the anchor for everybody, to say, like, oh, we're in the 70s now, and in the 70s, we're actually going to think a little bit more like this than like that. So that I think in some ways really gave me my purpose on the show, just because it was, when you're acting, creating, directing, you have to be in that scene. I didn't have to be in that scene. I showed up, I watched, I said, great, okay, I'm going to go talk about tomorrow's scene now. And, so actually I loved it, because I love work, and I love the adrenaline rush of it.
Well, and this is also such personal material. I mean, for me, to see kind of the history of, to see this span of queer history, long before, meant much of it before I was even born, to see the realities. I feel like this is almost, as much as it is a piece of drama, it's also a piece of history. It almost functions like a historical text for many ways, because I know I learned things that I had only heard in passing from older people, and it was so informative to see it in front of me.
Oh, Tony, I'm so glad that you brought up that point, because something I'm really proud of is that our show was meticulously researched. The researcher is the only employee. He stopped working 1 week before I wrapped. He was on the show as long as I was. A great researcher. So everything that McCarthy and Cohn, for example, say in public in our show, they actually said in public. Everything that happens in a hearing actually happened. It's all from transcripts. Senator Smith is based on Senator Lester Hunt, which everything about the polygraph, everything that the psychiatrist in episode 5, who Hawk takes Lucy's brother Leonard to this, that's all from a psychiatrist of the period. So we were absolutely rigorous about the research, the research on this show. So the history, people, I actually got some reactions from people who are angry, and some said, when in the early episodes, when Hawk gives up somebody's name and then later Mary abandons her partner, in light of what might happen to her in her career. And, that everything, all of that pressure was absolutely true. The questions that the investigator from the M unit, when he asks Hawk in episode 4 to walk across the room, to read from Of Human Bondage, that's all real. That was all documented. So we had that. That actually gives you something to hold on to as a showrunner, as a writer, creator, because if it was too far, we would say, yeah, but what's the research say? Now, we do have fictional characters going through history. So all of that stuff we, felt, that was ours that we owned. But the anchor, the history of it is really, really, I would say accurate, right on.
Yeah, and with Hawk in particular, this is a character who is very much a character of his time, um, whose actions, even though they're sometimes deplorable, even though there's sometimes you want to yell at Tim to run in the opposite direction, um, that they're always anchored in the reality that queer people had to deal with at that time.
Yes. Well, one of the books I recommend that people read, I gave everybody a reading list when they signed on to the show, was Gore Vidal's second novel, The City and the Pillar. And it was published in 1948, and you really get inside the head of a man who was homosexual. There was no gay at that time, and I wanted people to understand that there was no gay identity. We're so concerned, and perhaps rightly so, with our identities today. Which letter, which of those letters, LGBTQIA, do I sort of belong in? But that didn't exist. There was no gay thing out there. There were just people who had sex with people of the same gender. Now, there was a culture that was being created, in bars and underground places, but that was a completely hidden culture. So I thought it was very important that we have empathy for people who lived in a different time and think differently than we do. So that very much informs Hawk. But I also think, Tony, Hawk specifically, but also Tim, I was very passionate about saying to people, this isn't a gay show. These are human beings. Everybody has felt loss. Everybody has been afraid of falling in love with the wrong person. Everyone has been afraid of showing their emotions because they might get hurt. Those are grief, love. It is human. That's what we're doing. We're doing a human drama here. And we're doing American history. This isn't a gay show. You're not playing a gay character. You're playing a human character. And that I think people were happy in some ways to be, especially the younger people. I had to kind of peel their identity away from them. Like, no, sorry, you're not worried about your gay colleagues. You don't want to have anything to do with them. You're afraid of them.
Well, and but I think that's one of the important aspects of the show, is that the fact that it is, about queer people, and yet it is so universal. The message is so universal, which I think made the constant kind of talk about, the intimate scenes kind of reductive, in my opinion, because you wouldn't say that. I hope we get to the point where that is not a talking point anymore.
Well, I love that people talked about it because it means they're talking about the show. So, we were happy to push the envelope there. But, something that, I know that Robbie and Dan and I and Matt, my fellow EPs, that we talked a lot about was that even though there are bad things happening to people in the show, and there are hearts that are broken and lives that do get destroyed, people still found a way to have joy. And one of the ways that gay people found joy was in sex. They sneak into that apartment, they lock that door, and then they go at it, and they find joy and passion, in that hidden place. So it was very important to us that they weren't sad, oppressed victims walking around expressing their sadness and victimhood. That they were actually finding, a way to like have fun, to listen to music, to and to fall in love, even though it was dangerous.
Yeah, those spaces, I think, particularly like, say, like the Fire Island episode, it is a sense of freedom because that was the only freedom that they were allowed at the time.
Well, it was the 70s, which is what I came out in 1978. And it was like I had Dorothy landing in Oz, literally. I had to go to New York City to go to, but this is the thing. My partner and I at the time, we didn't use the word partner, maybe boyfriend, I'm not sure. We were both students at Columbia University. We would take the IRT train all the way down to Christopher Street and get out at Sheridan Square and walk and that down Christopher Street because it was the only place in Manhattan where we could hold hands and be relatively safe. And I mean relatively safe because there was gay bashing on Christopher Street, but you couldn't do that anywhere else. We got chased out of a movie theater once. We were just sitting next to each other. I mean, I would never have held hands in public. I wouldn't have dared. But we were chased by the ushers down the street who told us they were going to kill us. So there were these pockets of great liberation, and the 70s were just thrilling. It was just it really, really, really was fun. And sex was such a big part of it. We're free to have sex. We're free to go to this disco and take off most of our clothes. It was a revolution.
So I want to ask just about the partnership with Dan Minahan, because his stamp is all over this. I've interviewed him before, and he's such, everybody else has talked about like what a visual person he is, about how every frame just looks so good. What was his, how significant was he to this?
Incredibly. He was my anchor. And Dan actually, we can talk about people being visual, but Dan actually what really cares about is character and story, and so Dan and I early on, we were about to shoot a scene. I think it was the first time Hawk and Tim meet, and Hawk and Tim are alone in Tim's apartment in episode 1. And by the time you're ready to shoot a scene, you've discussed that scene maybe a month ago with the writer and everybody, but you've done a million things since. I remember Dan came to me and said, I don't know what the story point of the scene is. And I said, okay, let's sit down, let's talk about it. And we figured it out. Then we made it a habit. Before every scene, we would say, what's the story point of the scene? And so Dan really helped me. Then I continued that with every director who came on. Let's just remember, what's the point of the scene? Like in one sentence. And that really put me in sync with the directors and helped all of us. So Dan is a complete director, not just the guy who does the visuals, but yes, I mean, look at those. Look how beautiful. And Simon Dennis, who shot episodes 1 and 2, and Ronald Plant. I mean, our DPs were beautiful, and I think most of the show is beautiful. All the show is beautiful. So, but Dan really being there in prep with me and getting through those first 2 episodes, and it was the first time I was a showrunner. And Dan at one point actually at one point said, come into my office, sit down. And he pointed at our schedule calendar. And he said, you see, and he pointed to December 15th, which was our last day of shooting. He said, you're not going to make it. You're not going to survive to December 15th because you are trying to be involved in everything. Trust people, let them do their jobs. And you focus on what you need to focus on and tell people, no, you don't have time to think about that. Tony, that was such a liberating thing. And that came from a guy who's had so much experience, working with writers and showrunners. So it was a beautiful moment. I kind of felt like taken care of by Dan.
Well, I want to ask because, as I said, this was so. I wish I had had something like this when I was young, to actually be able to see myself throughout history. And I feel like I hope that you've created something that is going to be such an important, piece of art for young queer people. What do you hope the legacy of this show is?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I as recently as a year ago, actually, or so, year and a half ago, I had a young person up in Toronto tell me that Philadelphia changed his life. And I said, you were born the same year it was released. So how is that possible? And he told me how it was possible. That a health teacher had shown it in his class in high school in San Salvador, in a Catholic high school. And he didn't realize you could actually discuss being gay in public. And he said, I realized I'd be okay. I get choked up when I tell that story. So what I care about is how fellow travelers affects people emotionally, and that it allows us, I think, to view everybody whose paths we cross as fellow human beings. Even Roy Cohn, by the way, who did so much evil, destroyed hundreds of lives, and was a mentor to the biggest threat the United States has seen in a long time, the guy with the orange hair who should be in jail. Even though Roy Cohn was that monster's mentor, Roy Cohn was a human being who once loved somebody. And people get angry when I say that Roy Cohn was a human being. But they just want to see him as a monster. But human beings are capable of doing really bad things to each other. That's part of our humanity. So that's what I hope the legacy of Fellow Travelers is that it brings the history of queer people on par with the importance of history of straight people. And I'll tell you one more thing, Tony. I said this at the Writers Guild when I received an award this year. And I said, I said to my straight colleagues, I said, I bet you've never been in a room and given a pitch and had an executive say to you, wow, we love your pitch. We just have one question. Why is the main character straight? I bet you've never heard that question, because I heard the opposite many times in my life. Why does the main character have to be gay? Well, because I'm gay, and that's what I want to write about. So that's what I hope, that we break this gay show barrier, and that we weren't telling gay history, we were telling American history and human history.
And doing it in such a beautiful way. Ron, thank you so much. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the upcoming award season, and stay tuned for interviews with more contenders. Ron Nyswaner, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony.